Welcome back. We are going to continue with our discussion about the different kinds of therapeutic approaches and move on to a very different approach than psychoanalytic, and that is humanistic therapy. This involves approaches of Carl Rogers, who you can see there on the left, and Frederick Perls, who you can see on the right, and we will see both of them in the Gloria videos that you're going to watch later this week. So the humanistic therapy is a broad term meant to discuss, it's a category that emphasizes the importance of free choice and one's tendency toward growth. The idea behind it is that if we give clients the right environment, they will grow and develop. So let's take a look at that on the next screen. I've got a little bit more about humanistic therapy here. As I just mentioned, emphasizes that people have free choice, and we are born with this tendency toward growth. We are born moving forward, wanting to grow, wanting to change. That is an innate tendency in people. So the person that's probably most closely associated with humanistic therapy is, of course, Carl Rogers, and obviously we've talked about him a number of times this semester in different contexts. And I'm not sure how much background information I gave to you about him, but he lived pretty old here. He was still continuing to work into his late 80s, and he actually died from cardiac arrest after having hip surgery, but really enjoyed very good health up until that time. Rogers was actually at Ohio State for a while, and my little known fact, my graduate advisor in graduate school at Ohio State, actually his office was Carl Rogers' old office. So I would sit there many times meeting with my advisor, just kind of imagining Rogers in there with all of his colleagues. It was really cool. I have a little video clip here I want to show that does a bit of an introduction to Rogers' theory. Okay, I'm going to be honest here. I cannot figure out the technology to actually show that here in this video so you can see it, but I'm going to put the link in the comments at the bottom of this video so you can watch over it. I will have to say that, with changing over to online teaching, the learning curve has just been huge for me the last couple of weeks, just learning all kinds of new technology. And I'm so proud of the things I've learned, but I certainly have a long way to go. And that's one of the things that I still need to learn. So give that video a watch. Is just a good way to understand a little bit more about his theory. But we're going to start with the same place we did with Freud, and that is by looking at his theory of behavior change. The way to think about it is that for Rogers, it's all about the way you were treated when you grew up by parents, by teachers, by other significant people in your life. And if a child is given an environment of what we call unconditional positive regard, that the child and people will naturally pursue a healthy course of development and self-actualization. So we are all born with this drive to self-actualize, and all we need is the correct environment, the right environment to do that. We will pursue our natural tendencies. It will allow us to gain insight into our feelings. And if we have a good therapist who's giving us unconditional positive regard, those things will happen naturally. We'll pursue our tendencies and we'll be able to understand our feelings much, much better. So, the client-centered therapy, humanistic therapy, really is the background of all therapies. All therapists, probably except psychoanalysts, use it to some extent, more or less, but it's best to think of it as really the background. It is not effective by itself for serious disturbances. So if a client has, say, schizophrenia, having delusions and hallucinations, they're going to need more than just client-centered therapy. Because as we'll talk about, we've already covered quite a bit of client-centered therapy. For Rogers, if the client is given an environment of genuineness, empathy, an unconditional positive regard, and remember we talked about those as being components of the real relationship, they will heal. For Rogers, those qualities were all that was necessary for healing for the client. So that's basically the therapy right there in a nutshell. It's succinct, it's parsimonious. Some people think it's too simple, but really it's the foundation for how we treat people. So when we talk about the process of counseling here for client-centered therapy, Rogers really moved away from techniques. The things we've talked about, the reflective listening, the open-ended questions, the directives, all those were part of Rogers' therapy, but he didn't use anything specific beyond that. So he moved away from that, and he moved more toward the quality of the relationship. I've mentioned a number of times to you that for Rogers, the personhood of the counselor is far more important than any kind of technique that they could use. So what Rogers focused on were things we've already talked about: active listening and reflective responding. Those are the most powerful techniques that you can use, that a counselor could use for this kind of therapy. Now, the main things that this therapy is meant to do is to heal the split between the real self and the ideal self. So our real self is how we really perceive ourselves, our accurate perceptions of who we are. So if you think about the qualities that you would say you have, you might say, oh, I have a sense of humor, and I like to be with people, but I'm kind of impatient and I'm really stubborn. So how you realistically see yourself. The ideal self is the part of you that came from messages of other people, the shoulds and the coulds and the must be's. So all the messages you learned growing up, that you should get hundreds on everything, you should always get A's, you should be best in every sport. Well, those are the messages that we really internalize, and it becomes part of our ideal self. The closer our real self is to our ideal self, the healthier we're going to be. So it really looks like this here. We are considered to be incongruent when our real self is very different than our ideal self. So who you see yourself as being is different than who you think other people want you to be and who society has kind of molded you to be. We say you are incongruent. But down here, the more overlap between your ideal self and your real self, the more congruent you are. And we know congruency is a greater state of health, because we know that there's not much difference between who you see yourself as being and who other people see yourself as being. This next slide is a cartoon. It's hard to see, but the dad says, just remember, son, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose unless you want daddy's love. That's really pretty accurate, and very few parents are going to say to their kids, oh, I'm only going to love you if you get all A's or if you're the star on the team. But kids get unconscious messages about that. As an example, and I may have shared this with you before, so forgive me if I have, when I was young and I would bring home a test, if it was an A but not 100, my mom would say, well, why wasn't it 100? And her goal, of course, was to get me to do the best that I could and further my goals. But the message I kind of got is, I guess an A isn't enough. Perfect is what's necessary. So what does client-centered therapy look like in terms of the change that we see in clients? There's many changes that we see once a client begins to improve in client-centered therapy, but there are 7 in particular I want to talk about, some of the most important ones. So the first one is that the client becomes increasingly free in expressing their feelings. So no longer are feelings disallowed. We've talked about how in many families, people aren't allowed to be angry. And so in client-centered therapy, clients learn that no matter how they feel, anger, shame, hurt, it's all okay. Those expressed feelings are increasingly self-referent. And I know I've also mentioned that many times when clients come in, they'll talk about other people, what this person did to them and what that person did to them and how unfair things are. But we want them to talk about themselves and their own feelings. We really don't want them, it's not helpful to hear about other people. So those expressed feelings are increasingly self-referent. We also know those feelings refer to incongruity. So remember, a person who's in congruence, there is a split between their real self and the ideal self. Rogers says that split is the main problem that people have with mental health, and he calls it a mental disease, a dis-ease. It's a dis-ease with the self. So mental problems, emotional problems are a dis-ease with the self, a split between that real self and ideal self. Isn't that the most clever thing you've ever heard? It was not me that made that up, but I think it's pretty cool. It's a disease. It's a dis-ease. Okay, we also know that the change involves expressing long feelings, long denied feelings. So anger is a good one. Rage is a good one. People grew up not being able to talk about that. So now in therapy, because all feelings are okay, they're able to do that. We also know that after a while, clients begin to express unconditional positive self-regard because they are in an environment where the counselor values them and gives them unconditional positive regard. or unconditional positive regard, now they learn to be able to give that to themselves. And that's an important part of mental health, being able to give that to yourself. They also see themselves as the locus of self-control. So they are the ones that are in charge of their destiny, not their parents or their horoscope or anything else. And then finally, clients will react less in terms of conditions of worth and more in terms of their own internal needs. So if a client's trying to make a decision about something, they're thinking less about what they should do and what other people think that they should do, and more in terms of what they want to do and what they feel like is really congruent with them. So, what is the product of therapy here? When a person goes through client-centered therapy and emerges feeling better and with a lot of these products that we just talked about, they are what we consider to be a fully functioning person. Rogers made clear to emphasize that fully functioning people are not a destination. This isn't the goal. It's not a place you reach. It's more of a process of becoming. So we more and more accept ourselves. We more and more don't conform our behaviors to what other people want, and we become more and more congruent. That's really the result. So fully functioning people come from environments of unconditional positive regard, and they are congruent. People who have problems and are maladjusted come from environments of conditions of worth, and they are incongruent. Now, there's been a lot of research done on Rogers therapy. I just want to mention one seminal, one historically important piece of research here. So Truax and Carkhuff, who are some famous older counseling psychologists back in the 60s, found originally that environments that include empathy, unconditional positive regard, and genuineness are the best environments to bring out the likelihood of client change. Clients have a hard time changing. Lots of people have a hard time changing. But in the context of that counseling environment, change is the most likely. This picture, I really like this picture. Rogers, after he published his theory, started doing a lot of encounter and awareness groups. This was in the 70s when that was a really big thing, but it got us started on the road to all the self-help groups we now know about. And this is a nice picture of him leading that.